I was 17 years old this summer. My father decided that a fishing trip to Haida Gwaii was more important than his children. He didn't phrase it that way, of course. He never did. He said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. His buddy Warren had a cousin with a boat, and the salmon were running, and it was only going to be 3 weeks, maybe 4. He said my brother Kyle was 12 and basically capable of taking care of himself. He said I was practically an adult. He left $40 on the kitchen counter and a note that said, "Be good. Back before school starts. Love, Dad." $40 for 3 weeks for 2 people. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after his truck disappeared down the road, just staring at that $40. 2 20s, folded in half, sitting next to the sugar bowl like it was nothing, like it was enough. Kyle came downstairs about 20 minutes later in his pajamas, hair sticking up on one side, squinting at me. "Where's Dad?" "Gone," I said. He looked at the note. He looked at me. He was 12, but he wasn't stupid. "How long?" He said 3 weeks. Kyle sat down at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "There's no food." He was right. There was half a box of pasta, some canned tomatoes, a jar of peanut butter that was mostly scraped out, and whatever condiments had accumulated in the fridge door over the past year. My father had not gone grocery shopping before he left. He had not, apparently, thought that far ahead. I picked up the $40 and put it in my pocket. "Get dressed," I said. "We need to figure some things out." What people don't understand when they hear a story like this is that the first few days aren't the hardest. The first few days you're running on adrenaline and problem-solving mode. You make lists. You ration. You tell yourself it's temporary, it's fine, you can handle this. The hard part comes later. The hard part is when the adrenaline wears off and you realize that this is actually your life right now and no one is coming to fix it. I spent the first day figuring out our financial situation, which took about 10 minutes because there wasn't much to figure out. $40 minus a grocery run to the superstore for the basics. Bread, eggs, more peanut butter, some apples, a bag of rice, a carton of oat milk because that was what Kyle drank, left me with $11 and change. $11. For the rest of however long our father decided his fishing trip was going to last. The rent was paid. That was automatic, a pre-authorized payment that came out of my dad's account on the 1st of the month. I knew that because I'd watched him set it up one afternoon when he couldn't figure out the online banking portal, and I'd had to help him. The utilities were on a similar system, so the apartment itself was safe. But safe doesn't mean fed. Safe doesn't mean there's money for the bus, or for Kyle's soccer registration that was due in 2 weeks, or for the school supply list that had come home in June and that I'd put on the fridge and that my dad had looked at and said, "Yeah, we'll sort that out in August." I was good at math. I'd always been good at math. I sat at the kitchen table that first evening and I worked out exactly how many days the food I'd bought could last us if we were careful. 14 days, maybe 16 if Kyle didn't complain too much about smaller portions. And our father had said 3 weeks, maybe 4. I looked at the numbers for a while. Then I did what any reasonable 17-year-old does when they realize they need money. I started looking for work. This was mid-July in a mid-sized city in British Columbia, tourist season. The kind of weather that makes people want to eat ice cream and sit on patios and spend money they've been saving since February. I thought, someone needs help. I thought, I'm available. I put on a clean shirt and I went up and down the main commercial street near our apartment and I asked at every single place that had a door. Coffee shops, restaurants, the little independent bookstore on the corner, the garden center near the intersection, the smoothie place that always had a line out the door. I asked if they needed summer help, dishwashers, counter staff, anyone. I was 17, I said. I was available immediately, any shift, any hours. Most of them said no. Some of them said, come back when you're 18. One woman at a bakery actually looked sorry about it, which I appreciated. But the garden center said yes. Her name was the owner, a woman in her late 50s, with dirt permanently under her fingernails and a no-nonsense way of looking at you that I immediately respected. She said she needed someone to water, weed, move inventory, talk to customers about plants. She said it was 30 hours a week at $15 an hour, which was minimum wage, but it was something. She said, "Could I start Monday?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. $450 a week before tax. It wasn't a lot. It was more than I'd had 20 minutes earlier. I walked home and I told Kyle, and he said, "So we're not going to starve?" "No," I said, "we're not going to starve." He nodded and went back to his video game, and I went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for a while and let myself feel how scared I actually was, since there was no one around to see it. The garden center was physically demanding in a way I hadn't entirely anticipated. I came home every evening with dirt in my hair and my arms aching and my feet sore from standing on concrete in inadequate shoes. But I liked it, honestly. I liked the repetitive work, liked learning which plants needed what, liked the customers who came in with photos on their phones of whatever was dying in their garden and needed help diagnosing the problem. There was a woman who came in twice a week, every week, always in the early morning. She was probably 65, originally from somewhere in Ontario, I guessed from her accent, with white hair cut short and a canvas hat she wore pulled down over her ears even in the heat. She bought things in small amounts, a flat of petunias here, some tomato cages there, and she always spent a long time looking before she decided. Her name was Agnes. She figured out pretty quickly that I knew what I was talking about when it came to the plants. And she started asking me questions, and we got into the habit of talking for a while whenever she came in. One morning she came in, and I was in the back moving a pallet of soil bags, and she found me there and said, just conversationally, "You look tired." I said I was fine. She looked at me the way people look at you when they know you're not fine, but they're deciding whether to push it. Then she said, "You eat breakfast this morning?" I had not. I'd given Kyle the last of the bread for toast, and there hadn't been anything else. I don't know why I told her. I hadn't told anyone. My best friend thought I was just working for the summer. I hadn't called my mom. My parents had split up when I was 11, and she lived in Calgary with my stepdad, and our relationship was functional, but not the kind where I could call and say, "Dad abandoned us. Can you help?" Or maybe I just didn't want to admit that this was real. But Agnes asked, and something in the way she asked made it feel safe to answer honestly. "My dad went on a trip," I said. "It's been 3 weeks. He was supposed to be back already." She was quiet for a moment. "And your brother?" "He's 12. He's at home." She nodded slowly, like she was processing this. Then she said, "Come for dinner tonight, both of you. I'll give you the address." I started to say no out of reflex, and she held up one hand and said, "I'm not asking." Agnes's house was a 15-minute bike ride from our apartment, a small craftsman bungalow with a vegetable garden that took up almost the entire front yard. She lived with her husband, a retired high school shop teacher named Gord, who shook Kyle's hand very seriously and showed him his woodworking setup in the garage while Agnes and I made dinner. She made roast chicken and roasted vegetables and a salad from things she'd grown herself, and she didn't make a big deal of it, didn't act like it was charity, just set it on the table like it was a normal Tuesday dinner, and we happened to be there. Kyle ate 3 helpings of everything. After dinner, while Gord was showing Kyle how to use a hand plane, Agnes sat across from me at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea and said, "Tell me the rest." So I did. I told her about the $40 in the note and the grocery math and the job and the 11 days we'd already gotten through. I told her about the soccer registration and the school supplies and the way I lay awake at night doing calculations in my head about how much longer we could manage if my dad didn't come back before the month was out. Agnes listened to all of it without saying anything. When I finished, she said, "Have you called him?" "I've tried," I said. "Cell service is bad where he is." "He called once, a week ago, said everything was great, and he'd be back soon. Did you tell him you needed him to come back?" I looked at my tea. Not exactly. She didn't push that. She just said, "Okay." I didn't know what okay meant at the time. I found out the next morning when I showed up for work and she was already there, talking to my boss, And the two of them looked at me with that expression that means decisions have been made on your behalf, and they are, theoretically, for your own good. My boss knew a woman who ran a community organization out of a church hall on Pemberton Avenue, not a religious thing, just a space they rented to groups that needed it. This woman, her name was Daphne, coordinated food recovery in our neighborhood. She worked with grocery stores and restaurants and caterers to pick up food that was still good but couldn't be sold, and she distributed it to families who needed it. She needed a summer driver, someone with a license who could do pickup runs in the mornings, Tuesday through Saturday, and help sort and distribute in the afternoons. I had my license. I'd gotten it in March. The car's covered under our insurance, Daphne told me when I went to meet her. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, practical and quick-talking, with the energy of someone who operates on 4 hours of sleep by choice. It's a van. You'll need to learn the route. Pay is $16.50 an hour, 20 hours a week. I already have a job, I said. I know, she said. This would be 6 to noon. Your boss says you're in at 1. You'd have an hour to eat. I looked at her. You already talked to her? Daphne smiled. Agnes knows a lot of people. I did the math in my head. 20 hours at $16.50 was $330, plus the $450 from the garden center. That was close to $800 a week before tax, which was more than my dad made, which was… I didn't let myself finish that thought. I'll do it, I said. The food recovery work changed things for me in ways I didn't expect. I want to be clear about how it actually worked, because I've told this story before and people get confused about the money. The driving job paid me a wage. That's where my income came from. The food we recovered, the day-old bread from the Cobb's franchise on the highway, the produce that was one day past its display date from the IGA, the catered sandwiches left over from corporate lunches downtown that went to families registered with Daphne's organization, and to the drop-in at the church, and to a few other distribution points around the neighborhood. I wasn't selling it. I was moving it from places that had too much to places that needed it, and I was being paid for my labor, the same as any other job. But here's what happened. I started to understand the system. I started to see which restaurants threw out the most usable food, which bakeries had regular overstock, which days the grocery stores did their markdowns. I started to see the gaps. The Tuesday afternoon gap when the drop-in was closed, but the food bank didn't open until Wednesday, the way certain families were registered but couldn't make it to the distribution point because of bus schedules or mobility issues, or the fact that they worked afternoons. I started filling the gaps. Nothing dramatic at first. I'd drop off an extra bag at a building I passed on my route if I knew a family there was having a hard month. I'd coordinate with the woman who ran the Tuesday drop-in about doing a second, smaller distribution on Thursday afternoons when I had the van. I started keeping a list in my phone, not in an organized way, just notes of who needed what and when. Kyle, who had nothing else to do that summer, started coming with me on the Thursday runs. He was better with people than I was, honestly. He remembered names, remembered details, had a way of talking to the elderly people we delivered to that made them feel like they were being visited by a friend rather than receiving charity. One of the women we delivered to regularly, she was in her early 70s, had limited mobility, lived alone on the 14th floor of a building on McGill Road. She told me once, "You know, you're the only person I see some weeks." I went home that evening and I told Kyle what she'd said. He was quiet for a minute, then he said, "We should fix that." So we did. We started connecting people. We had a phone now. I'd put Kyle on my plan, which cost me an extra $15 a month that I figured out how to absorb, and we started a group chat for the building on McGill Road. Just a way for the residents to talk to each other, check in, let someone know if they needed something picked up from the pharmacy. It sounds small. It was small. But the woman on the 14th floor told me later that she'd learned 3 of her neighbors had the same specialist, and they'd started sharing rides to appointments. That's the thing about gaps. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. And once you start filling one, you realize it connects to 6 others. My father came back on a Thursday evening in late August, 6 weeks after he'd left. 6 weeks. He'd said 3, then maybe 4. Then, when he'd called again in early August with bad cell service cutting his voice in and out, he'd said just a bit longer, "The salmon are really running, I'll make it up to you both." I was making dinner when I heard his key in the lock. Kyle was at the kitchen table, doing the back-to-school supply list I'd finally gotten around to sorting out from my own money. I'd bought everything except the graphing calculator, which the school allowed you to borrow from the library if you applied ahead of time, which I had done. The door opened and my father walked in with a duffel bag over his shoulder and a cooler of fish he'd apparently driven across 3 provinces with. He looked around the apartment. It was tidy. I'd kept it tidy, partly out of habit, and partly because having control over the physical space was the only way I could manage everything else. There was food on the stove. Kyle's soccer boots were by the door, cleaned and ready for the first practice of the fall season, which I had signed him up for and paid for. There was a whiteboard on the wall near the fridge where I'd been tracking our schedule and our budget because I'd needed somewhere to put it all. He looked at the whiteboard for a long moment. Then he said, "You guys seem to manage okay." I didn't say anything. Kyle looked up from his supply list and looked at our father and then looked at me. He was 12. He'd spent the summer learning routes and names and how to talk to people on the 14th floor of a building on McGill Road. He'd spent the summer watching me come home exhausted and make dinner anyway and do the math and get up at 5:30 in the morning to make the Tuesday pickup run. "We managed," Kyle said. "She did." My father looked at the cooler. He said, "I brought fish." I thought about a lot of things in that moment. I thought about the $40. I thought about Agnes and Gord and Daphne and the woman on the 14th floor and the group chat and the Thursday runs. I thought about the $800 a week I'd been earning and the fact that I'd managed to put $320 into a savings account despite everything because I'd decided somewhere around week 3 that I was not going to end this summer with nothing. I thought about all the ways I could respond to "I brought fish." What I said was, "There are plates in the same place they've always been." He didn't understand right away the full extent of what had happened that summer. I don't think he let himself. It's easier not to. But things shifted, the way things shift sometimes. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with tears or ultimatums, but slowly in the accumulation of small moments where reality becomes undeniable. He came to pick Kyle up from soccer practice one afternoon and ran into a woman named Priscilla from the building on McGill Road who was there watching her grandson. She recognized Kyle and came over and they talked, and she told my father that she didn't know what she would have done that summer without us. He didn't say anything about it when he got home, but later that week, I found him in the kitchen at 11 at night with the whiteboard, reading everything I'd written there over the past 6 weeks. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He said, without turning around, "Why didn't you call me?" "I tried," I said. "The cell service was bad." "I mean, really call me," he said. "Really tell me what was happening." I thought about that, because, I said, I didn't think it would change anything. And I didn't want to give you the chance to tell me I was being dramatic. He turned around then. He looked older than he had 6 weeks ago, though I knew that wasn't really possible. He looked like someone who was beginning to understand something they hadn't wanted to understand. "I wouldn't have said that," he said. "You've said it before." I said, "When I've told you things were hard, you say I'm catastrophizing." He didn't argue with that. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the whiteboard again, at the weeks of budget calculations and pickup schedules, and the $320 savings figure I'd written in the bottom right corner and circled. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first time in my life I could remember him saying that to me and meaning it. I don't want to oversell this moment. It wasn't a transformation. He didn't immediately become the father I'd needed him to be for years. People don't work that way, and I'd be lying if I told you that one apology in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night fixed everything that had accumulated between us over 17 years. But it was real. It was the first real thing he'd given me in a long time. Okay, I said, and I went to bed. I kept both jobs through September while I figured out what came next. Daphne offered me a part-time permanent position with the Food Recovery Organization, which I accepted. I deferred my college application by a year. I'd been planning to go to Thompson Rivers in Kamloops to study social work, and I still wanted to do that, but I wanted to do it having saved enough money that I wasn't going in broke. Kyle started grade 7. He'd grown 2 inches over the summer and had a kind of quietness about him now that hadn't been there before, a steadiness. His teacher called my father in October to say Kyle was doing well. He was showing real leadership in the classroom. She was impressed by his maturity. My father came home from that meeting and told me about it, and I could hear in his voice that he was proud, and also that he was only beginning to understand that the reason Kyle had that maturity was the summer that had just happened. Priscilla from McGill Road became a kind of unofficial grandmother to both of us. She organized a potluck in her building to celebrate her granddaughter's birthday, and she invited Kyle and me, and we went, and it was one of the best afternoons I'd had in a long time, crowded and loud and full of food and people who knew each other's names. I thought about that woman, that first week, standing in the kitchen looking at $40 on the counter. I thought about how closed in everything had felt, how I'd sat on the edge of the bathtub and tried not to cry because I didn't have time to cry. I thought about Agnes telling me she wasn't asking about dinner, about Kyle eating 3 helpings of everything. There's a version of this story that's about survival, and that's true. We survived. But I think what I actually learned that summer was something different. I learned that the systems that exist to help people, the food banks, the community organizations, the programs, and the networks, they only work if someone shows up to run them. And the people who show up to run them are usually people who've needed them. People who know exactly where the gaps are because they've fallen through them. I didn't plan to become someone who fills gaps. I didn't have a plan at all that July morning when I stood in the kitchen with $40 and a brother who needed breakfast. But I showed up. I kept showing up. And that, I think, is most of it. My father is different now in the ways that matter. He tells Kyle when he's going somewhere. He asks before he assumes. He came to me last month with a bill he couldn't figure out. Something with his car insurance, and I sat with him at the kitchen table, and we worked through it together, and when we were done, he said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I know he meant it as a compliment. I know he was trying. I looked at him for a moment, this man who left 2 20s on a counter and drove away, and I thought, you would figure it out. People do. But what I said was, you don't have to find out. And I meant that too.